Out back behind the house, past the laundry line, and the rusted swing set, there was a garden. Not a fancy one. It didn't have landscaping stones or solar lights or decorative fountains. It was dirt, rows of it, planted and replanted by hands that knew the rhythm of seasons better than most calendars. We called it a vegetable garden, but that name didn't quite do it justice. Yes, it grew food, tomatoes, beans, squash cucumbers that curled like question marks. But it also grew something else, something quieter, something deeper. It grew the kind of memories that stick to your bones. That garden was a ritual. Spring meant turning the soil, sometimes with a rented tiller, sometimes just with a shovel and a strong back. Summer meant weeding under the hot sun beads of sweat, tracing our necks, and learning which bugs to swat and which ones to leave alone. Fall meant harvest, and not just picking vegetables, but carrying in pride. Winter meant looking out the window at the bare rows, remembering. We didn't grow food because it was trendy. We didn't call it organic or farm to table. We just called it dinner. The taste of a tomato still warm from the vine wasn't something to post about. It was just better, deeper, more real. The kind of flavor you only get from something that grew feet away from where you sleep. And the garden wasn't just for food. It was where we went when we needed quiet, when life inside got too loud, when the phone rang too much, or the walls felt too close. The garden was where you could pull weeds and think, where you could water the beans and cry without anyone asking why. It was a classroom, too. We learned about patience because seeds don't care how busy you are. About hope because every planting was a kind of faith. About disappointment because sometimes the rabbits got there first. About resilience because you planted again anyway. Parents didn't give lectures out there. They gave instructions, dig a little deeper. Water by the roots. Watch for the white butterflies, they'll eat your cabbage. But those lessons stuck longer than any scolding ever could. We weren't just growing food. We were growing together, side by side, with our hands in the same soil. We shared things we couldn't say inside. That's where we learned how Grandpa fought in the war, how Mom got her first job, how Dad almost left college, but didn't. These stories didn't come out at the dinner table. They came out between rows of corn, and sometimes we were just quiet, together, pulling weeds, flicking beetles, not needing to fill the air with anything but the sound of life growing slowly, inch by inch. The garden was also a test of commitment. You couldn't fake your way through it. If you skipped weeding for too long, the plants let you know. If you overwatered or forgot to water at all, things withered. It held a kind of honesty that the rest of the world often lacked. No shortcuts, no pretending. Just you, the soil, and the truth of what you put in. And oh, the joy of those first green shoots breaking through the earth. Tiny promises. You'd check on them daily, maybe even hourly, like watching hope take root. And when things grew tall, when the beans stretched up their poles like they were reaching for heaven, you felt proud. Not in a boastful way, but in a quiet, soul-deep way. Sometimes we'd bring out lemonade and sit on overturned buckets, just watching the rows. The hum of bees, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint creak of the swing set in the distance. It all made a kind of music. And in that music, we found rest. Even now, years later, when the house is gone and the swing set is a memory, I can still see the garden, still feel the rough handle of the hoe, still smell the green of snapped bean stems. That patch of earth fed more than our bodies. It fed our souls. The garden taught us timing. You had to know when to plant and when to wait, when to water and when to let the earth rest. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't cheat it. Everything had its moment, and somehow that rhythm seeped into how we lived the rest of our lives. We learned to read the clouds, not in the poetic sense, but literally. We'd glance at the sky and know if it would rain by evening. We could tell if it was going to be a dry spell, or if we had a storm coming that might batter the squash blossoms. We became weather watchers not because we had any choice, but because the garden demanded it. That sense of watching and waiting that was part of the magic. Today everything's instant. Groceries are delivered. Music streams in seconds. But back then, we waited for the first bloom, for the bees to come, for the zucchinis to finally grow fat enough to pick. And that waiting wasn't a burden. It was a kind of gift. There was something sacred about the tools, too. The worn shovel with the splintered handle, the old watering can with a dent on one side, the hoe that always leaned against the same corner of the fence. They weren't fancy, but they were reliable, familiar, like old friends you didn't see often but who always remembered your name. And the gloves, oh the gloves. We'd start each season with new pairs, bright and snug, but by summer's peak, they were crusted with dirt, the fingertips worn through, and somehow that made them better. They had done work. Real work. Saturdays were for chores, and the garden was always on the list. But it never felt like punishment. Even as kids, we understood that pulling weeds wasn't just about cleaning up the bed. It was about making space for things to grow. That's a lesson a lot of us carried into adulthood, even if we didn't realize it right away. And then there were the animals. Not pets, although the cat sometimes napped between rows, but the critters that came uninvited. Rabbits, of course. They were the villains of our childhood summers. We'd find their little prints near the lettuce and groan. There were also groundhogs who were bolder than they had any right to be. We tried everything, netting scarecrows, even strings of aluminum foil that danced in the breeze. But somehow they always got a bite. Still, it was hard to stay mad, because even the animals reminded us that the garden wasn't just ours. It belonged to the earth. We were guests, too, and sometimes the garden fought back. Late blight on the tomatoes, powdery mildew on the squash, a freak hailstorm that flattened the corn in minutes. We mourned those losses, not dramatically, but honestly. You'd walk out, see the damage, and just sigh, maybe even curse under your breath. But then you'd dig again, try again, plant again, because that's what the garden taught you. Resilience. The kind you don't learn from success, but from doing the hard thing, the thankless thing, again and again. There were good years, too. Glorious ones. When the cucumbers grew so fast we couldn't eat them all. When the green beans needed picking every morning. When we canned tomato sauce for the winter and lined the jars like soldiers in the pantry. Those were the years we celebrated, not with parties, but with quiet satisfaction. And those celebrations often happened right there in the garden. We'd bring out cold drinks, sometimes slices of watermelon. We'd sit in lawn chairs with dirt still under our nails and talk about nothing and everything. And when the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang, we knew we'd remember those evenings for a long, long time. Sometimes the garden became a stage. That's where we practiced school presentations, made up songs, played pretend. We turned the beanpoles into fortresses. The compost pile became a dragon's cave. The scarecrow, a misunderstood villain in one of our many plays. Imagination had roots in that soil, too. And when visitors came, relatives from the city, old friends from far away, the garden was always part of the tour. Not because it was beautiful in the traditional sense, but because it was ours. It was a source of pride, of identity, a living scrapbook we shared one row at a time. Even the mistakes became part of the story. Like the year we planted too many zucchini and had to snake extras onto neighbors' porches. Or the time someone mislabeled the seed packets, and we ended up with 3 rows of radishes and no carrots. We laughed about it eventually, because that's the other thing the garden taught us, humility. You couldn't control everything. Not the weather, not the bugs, not even the seeds sometimes. But you could show up. You could try again. You could keep planting, even after the worst seasons. And now, years later, when we walk past tidy suburban lawns or peek into someone's raised beds on Instagram, we smile. But it's not the same. The garden we had wasn't just aesthetic. It was lived in, worn in, filled with stories and sweat and love. It was a patch of earth that held our history, our lessons, our laughter. It was where we learned that food wasn't just something to consume. It was something to care for, to nurture, to wait for. And in waiting, we learned patience. In losing, we learned perspective. In growing, we found hope. Even now, when we dig our hands into any soil, be it in a flower pot on a windowsill or a backyard bed, we're not just planting seeds. We're revisiting a time, a feeling, a lesson. We're reconnecting with those who came before us and maybe passing something on to those who come after. Because that's what the garden really gave us, a legacy. One tomato, one weed, one summer afternoon at a time. The garden had its own soundtrack. Not the kind you plugged into your ears, but the kind you heard all around you, whether you were listening or not. Bees buzzing around, blossoms, the soft flutter of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a morning dove, the rhythmic thud of a hoe hitting soil, the creak of a gate swinging open. These were the background notes of our growing up. Sometimes you'd catch a song on the wind, not from a speaker, but from someone in the next yard over humming as they worked, or a neighbor's radio playing a gospel tune on Saturday morning. These sounds folded into ours like multiple melodies weaving through the same chorus. The garden was never silent. It was alive in every sense. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Fresh tomato vines had their own perfume, green, sharp, almost electric. Basil released its scent just from a brush of the hand. You could smell the dirt itself when it had just been turned rich, damp, promising. The garden didn't just grow food. It grew sensory memories, the kind you'd carry in your nose for decades. There were moments of stillness, too. Early in the morning before the sun burned off the dew, you could stand barefoot in the grass, feel the coolness seep into your skin, and just breathe. It was quiet then, a sacred kind of quiet, like the earth hadn't fully woken yet, and you had it all to yourself for a while. That's when you saw the small miracles, the tight spiral of a squash blossom unfurling in slow motion, a spider web strung between 2 bean poles catching the light like spun silver, a ladybug navigating the jungle of parsley. These tiny moments didn't make the evening news, but they made our world. Sometimes the garden held secrets, like the time we found a rabbit nest tucked into the long grass behind the compost pile. Or when a neighbor's cat decided our mulch bed was her maternity ward. We learned to tread gently, to watch where we stepped, to remember that the garden wasn't just for us. It was a sanctuary, not in the grand cathedral sense, but in the everyday kind. A place where thoughts could stretch out, where you could talk to yourself without judgment, where you could work through a worry just by pruning a vine. The garden was therapy before we knew what therapy was, and it was a bridge between generations. Grandma showed us how deep to plant potatoes. Grandpa taught us how to sharpen a blade with nothing but a stone and patience. These weren't lessons from books. They were handed down by hand gesture by gesture. If you forgot, you didn't look it up, you asked, and someone always knew. The stories grew alongside the plants. Some were family lore about the year the pumpkins got so big we had to weigh them on the bathroom scale. Others were quieter, the time someone cried in the bean rows and didn't say why, and nobody pushed them to. The garden kept those stories safe. Let them compost, turn into something fertile. Rainy days were part of the rhythm, too. We'd watch from the porch as water danced on the leaves. Sometimes we worried, would it flood the roots? Would the tomatoes split? But mostly we were grateful. Rain meant rest. For the soil, for us, and harvest season that was its own celebration. We'd bring baskets outside and fill them until our arms ached. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans. The kitchen table would vanish beneath piles of produce. We'd blanch and freeze pickle and can give some away and keep the best. But even then it wasn't just about the food. It was about the hands that picked it, the voices that laughed over it, the shared effort that made it possible. And when dinner came, it tasted like reward. A tomato sandwich on still warm bread, corn on the cob, buttered and salted, green beans with bits of bacon. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough, more than enough. Because what we really harvested wasn't just food. It was time. It was love. It was something you couldn't jar or freeze or measure. It was ours. And when the season ended, we felt it in our bones. The garden grew quiet again. Not dead, just resting. The beds were cleared. The stakes pulled out, the last tomatoes picked, while still green. We knew the rhythm, life, pause, life again. We raked leaves into the compost, covered the rows in straw, and stored the tools like ritual. Not as chores, but as farewells. Like tucking someone in for a long sleep. And when the snow finally fell, it didn't feel like an end, just another breath before the next growing song. That's the thing about gardens. You never really leave them. Even years later in apartments with no yard, in cities with no soil, you find yourself buying a basil plant for the windowsill, watching the sky like a farmer, saving seeds in envelopes. The garden lives on quietly inside you, because we didn't just grow vegetables there. We grew up there, and that more than anything was the harvest we never forgot. By the time late summer rolled around, the garden had a different energy. The fresh urgency of spring was gone, replaced by a slower, deeper rhythm. Plants were taller, lazier in the heat. The leaves had lost their crisp newness, curling slightly at the edges, heavy with the season's weight. The bees moved slower, too, like they'd gotten used to the sweet, and no longer rushed to collect it. Even the sunlight felt different, less gold, more amber. It slanted through the trees at an angle that said, "Start wrapping it up." We knew we were nearing the end, and that made everything feel more precious. We'd take our time picking the last of the green beans, even if our baskets weren't full. We lingered near the zucchini vines, poking through leaves for the final stragglers. Some days we'd go out just to walk the rows. No tools, no chores, just to see, just to breathe it in before it was gone. The flowers, too, had their moment. Marigolds with their stubborn brightness, sunflowers, tall and tired heads, drooping like old men. They weren't showy anymore, but they stood their ground, guardians of the season's final breath. And the air, oh, the air. It smelled different now, still earthy, still sweet, but with a hint of goodbye. You could catch it on a breeze and feel it in your chest, that subtle pull of nostalgia, even while the season was still happening. It was during these late summer days that we talked more, not just about chores or what needed harvesting, but about real things. School starting up, family stuff, dreams, fears, random thoughts. Something about the garden in its final phase made people more honest. Maybe it was the reminder that everything ends, that growth slows, that what we have now won't always be. We'd gather the last tomatoes, even the cracked ones. Nothing went to waste. Those slightly bruised fruits, they became sauces and soups. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. Like we were honoring the whole season by making use of every bit. The compost pile grew taller. Every plant we pulled added to it, vines, leaves, stalks, spent flowers. The leftovers of growth returning to the soil. It wasn't garbage. It was investment, a promise to next year. And in between the work, there were these small golden pauses, sitting on overturned buckets, drinking cold lemonade, wiping sweat with the same towel used all summer, watching shadows stretch across the garden beds, listening to the wind play with the cornstalks. There was a kind of communion in those moments, a silent understanding between everyone who shared that patch of earth. We'd fought bugs, weather weeds, and we'd made something grow. Together. And when we saw that first leaf fall not from the garden, but from the big tree by the fence, we knew. It was almost time. So we walked slower, talked longer, held on to the heat in the soil and the buzz in the air. We let the season linger. Sometimes we picked up forgotten tools, a hand trowel buried in weeds, a glove dropped under the chard, and felt a small pang of sentiment. Even objects seemed reluctant to leave. We began tidying not to erase the season, but to prepare the ground for rest, pulling up stakes, rolling up twine, storing pots. It was a quiet ritual, a kind of gardening farewell, and in the evenings as the sun dipped lower and the crickets began their chorus, we'd sit out a little longer. Maybe we didn't say much. Maybe we just watched the twilight settle on leaves. But in that quiet, we felt the fullness of what we'd shared, because we knew the garden wasn't just giving us food. It was giving us time, with each other, with nature, with ourselves. And even as we prepared to say goodbye, we carried that gift with us, quietly, reverently, waiting for the next season to bloom. And yet as the season whispered its final notes, we found new rituals hidden in the endings, like saving seeds. We'd spread them out on old newspapers, label them in handwriting that always slanted more by September. Seeds from tomatoes, cucumbers, even sunflowers. Some we kept for ourselves. Others we gave away, passing on stories tucked in tiny envelopes. We also wrote things down, notes in gardening journals, scribbled reminders on seed packets. Tried trellis earlier. Too much shade near beans. It wasn't just about better crops next year. It was about honoring the learning, the quiet growth not just in soil but in us. And sometimes on those rare warm nights when summer refused to leave completely, we'd gather as a family in the dimming garden light, maybe with a blanket, maybe with dessert, the crickets chirping their steady song while we listened to the world slow down. One last time before the frost came. In those closing moments, the garden didn't seem smaller. It seemed deeper, a place where time didn't pass. It layered. We, lucky enough to live in that rhythm, understood that while the plants might sleep, the garden never truly ended. It just waited. And then there was the sound, quiet, sure, but unforgettable. The crunch of drying stalks underfoot, the wind brushing past corn leaves, the faint rustle of animals, squirrels mostly darting through the perimeter, sensing the shift just as we did. Nature, as always, moved ahead of us, packing up before we even reached for the baskets. One last afternoon we sat and made lists of what worked, of what didn't, of the things we'd do again, and the ones we'd leave behind. There was something almost holy about it, like priests recounting the gospel of soil and sun. Even the kids, distracted as they usually were, felt the change. They stopped asking to go back inside. They walked the rows on their own, not for chores, not for snacks, but because something in them understood this mattered. This was ending, and endings, if you're lucky, should be witnessed. And so we stayed a little longer each day, just to hold on to what couldn't be held. Because when the season fades and the earth rests, the garden doesn't disappear. It becomes memory, and memory feeds us in ways no harvest ever could. Winter was never the enemy, not really. It was the reset button, the pause, the breath between sentences. But still, when the first frost came and turned everything brittle, there was always a quiet ache. The garden went silent, and so did we. We'd walk by it on chilly mornings, coffee cups in handscarves pulled tight, and just look. No more green, no more buzzing bees or dirt under our nails, just frozen remnants of life sleeping under the surface. And yet even then it wasn't truly gone, because something happened to us during those months of nothing. We remembered. We remembered the way the soil smelled after a fresh rain in April. We remembered the sound of tomato skins splitting under our fingernails. We remembered how Grandpa used to hum while tying up the beanstalks, like it was a sacred ritual. And we planned. January was seed catalog season. Pages dog-eared and marked with notes like, "Try this one this year," or "Too bitter last time." We'd spread them out on the kitchen table like treasure maps, dreams of warmth and flavor in every glossy photo. Grandma always voted for more basil. Dad pushed for carrots. The kids wanted watermelons, even though we never quite got the timing right. Planning the garden became our winter ritual. It gave us something to look forward to, while the world outside was gray and still. It reminded us that the garden wasn't just a plot of land, it was part of our calendar. A reason to believe that time moves forward, that life returns. We'd sketch it out on scrap paper, a new layout every year, but with familiar corners. The cucumber patch would stay near the fence. The strawberries always along the back where they could spread their roots without being disturbed. And the sunflowers, oh, the sunflowers, they had their own place by the shed where they could lean with grace and tower over everything. Even in the dead of winter, we talked about soil, about compost, about the worms we hoped were doing their work underground. Dad swore by his mix of coffee grounds and crushed eggshells. Aunt June kept a chart of when to rotate crops. These conversations weren't boring, they were grounding. Sometimes we'd bundle up and go outside just to walk the frozen paths. Boots crunching, breath visible. We'd poke the earth with our boots and pretend we could feel it pulsing, resting, gathering strength, waiting for spring just like us. The kids would ask questions, ones they never asked in the middle of summer. Do the plants miss us? Will the worms be cold? We didn't always have answers, but we loved that they wondered. Wonder, after all, was part of gardening. We'd use the off-season to fix things, too. Sharpen tools, oil the handles, mend broken fences. Grandpa would sit in the garage with a radio, humming softly, sanding the splinters off the tomato stakes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred in its own way. And we cooked. We pulled jars of last season's tomatoes from the pantry and made sauce that tasted like sunlight. We sliced pickles and remembered the day we canned them. Everyone crammed into the kitchen, steam fogging up the windows. We brewed herbal teas from dried mint and chamomile. Every bite, every sip was a connection to something that felt bigger than food. Even holidays became garden-themed. That one year we strung dried chili peppers on the tree, or the time we gave seed packets as gifts, each with a handwritten note, for your windowsill, for your future salad, for next spring. The garden, even in hibernation, was never really dormant. We also kept journals, small notebooks with worn covers full of notes like try planting marigolds earlier or move squash further from tomatoes. Some entries were more poetic. Snow fell today, garden sleeping beneath a white blanket. Even those who weren't usually writers found themselves recording thoughts because the garden made us notice things. Neighbors would sometimes stop by, even in winter. We'd talk over fences or wave with mittened hands. We'd share pickles or pass along extra seed catalogs. The garden had a way of keeping the neighborhood stitched together like green thread running through our lives, even when nothing was growing. Mom once said winter was when the garden grew in our hearts. That's why it mattered so much to keep tending it, even when it wasn't visible, to honor the patience it taught us, the hope, the sense that no matter how frozen things looked, something was always happening beneath the surface. And then came the signs. The first robin on the lawn, the smell of thawing earth, the sun staying out just a little bit longer. Those tiny moments when you'd swear you heard the ground whisper, soon. We'd check the tools again, refill the watering cans, dust off the gloves, and just like that, the garden would call us back. Because we hadn't left it. Not really. We'd just been loving it quietly from a distance, through stories, through meals, through dreams written in seed catalogs. And when we finally stepped out that first real day of spring shovels in hand, boots muddy again, we didn't just return to the garden. We returned to ourselves, to the part of us that grows even when no one is watching, to the part of us that believes in seasons, to the part of us that knows there is always more to come. And so we began again. This wasn't just soil. This wasn't just food. This was us rooted hopeful and forever tending the quiet beauty of life. Spring never tiptoed into our world. It came crashing in with the sound of shovels hitting dirt, the scent of lilac on the wind, and the unmistakable chorus of frogs from the creek beyond the fence. The garden didn't wait. It demanded us. It pulled us out of our winter haze with sun-drenched mornings and mud-caked boots. The first days were messy, the soil still cold in patches, our hands clumsy from the long break. But we worked anyway, dug with purpose, raked with rhythm, planted like we had something to prove. And maybe we did. Maybe each seed was a quiet declaration, we're still here. We still care. Kids raced ahead always too fast, poking holes in the ground, dropping in seeds with sticky fingers, sometimes forgetting where. We didn't mind. The garden wasn't about precision. It was about joy. And there was plenty of it. Grandpa would bring out his wooden stool, the one with the worn legs and squeaky joints, and sit near the peppers. He said they needed encouragement, so he'd talk to them softly. Not in full sentences, but in hums and murmurs like you'd soothe a restless child. The rows didn't always line up. Some plants grew faster than others, but that was part of the charm. We learned to let the garden surprise us. Sometimes the wildest patch yielded the best cucumbers. Sometimes the thing we forgot we planted turned out to be the most beautiful. And oh, the flowers. Mom always insisted on making space for flowers. Zinnias, daisies, marigolds. She said a garden without flowers was like a song without melody. And when they bloomed, the whole backyard felt like it was singing. We'd host little picnics in the garden, not grand affairs, just sandwiches, lemonade, and a blanket. But somehow the sandwiches tasted better there. Maybe it was the basil still on our hands, or the smell of sun-warmed dirt, or the feeling that we were exactly where we belonged. Neighbors would wander by more often now. Not to borrow sugar or return tools, but to admire. To talk about their own gardens. To ask how we got the tomatoes so red or the beans so tall. There was a quiet pride in it. Not boastful, just shared satisfaction. Like we were all part of something ancient and good. There were lessons, too. Seeds that didn't sprout. Plants that wilted for no clear reason. Bugs that arrived overnight and left chaos behind. We didn't shield the kids from these things. We let them feel the disappointment, the frustration, and then we showed them how to start again. Some days it rained too much, others not enough. But the garden taught us resilience. It taught us to adapt, to trust cycles, to know that even if this crop failed, the soil still held promise. And then came harvest. Not all at once, of course. It started slow. A handful of cherry tomatoes, a single zucchini, but each one was a celebration. We'd hold it up like treasure, pass it around, admire it like art. It wasn't just food. It was proof. Proof of effort, of time, of belief. Dinner changed in the summer. We cooked less, ate simpler, sliced what we picked, drizzled with oil, sprinkled with salt. Nothing fancy, nothing needed to be. The food was alive with flavor, and every bite brought stories. Remember when we planted these too close? When the dog dug them up, when Lucy cried because she thought the lettuce had feelings. The garden also became a studio. Kids painted sunflowers on rocks. Grandpa sketched the rows from his stool. Aunt June kept a photo album, snapshots from every week. The garden wasn't just feeding us, it was inspiring us. And at night when the sun dipped low and the sky turned lavender, we'd sit quietly in lawn chairs, just watching. Not talking much, just being there, listening to crickets, letting the day settle in our bones, because by then we knew the garden didn't need to be explained. It just needed to be lived, and we were living it every messy, marvelous, sunburned, bug-bitten minute. It wasn't just a space outside our house. It was a place inside our hearts, and as the days grew long and warm, we knew this much for sure. The garden was working its magic again, and so were we. There were Saturday mornings that began with dew still fresh on the leaves. We'd shuffle out with mugs of coffee hair on brushed pajamas tucked into boots. Nobody said much. The garden didn't ask for chatter. It asked for presence. The soft kind. The kind that listens. There were squirrels that stole strawberries and birds that nested in the hedges. We cursed them, yes, but we also welcomed them. They belonged in their way. The garden was never just ours. It was a stage, a sanctuary, a shared pulse of the neighborhood. Sometimes we'd find old tools buried deep in the shed, rusted trowels, cracked pots, a watering can with a dent that never quite poured straight. But we used them anyway, because the garden wasn't about perfection. It was about continuity. Each season built on the one before it. Every handprint in the dirt had a history. We even had traditions. Planting day was always followed by pancakes, thick and sweet. And the first ripe tomato earned the honor of being sliced at the table, with everyone watching. No one ate until we all had a bite, a silent kind of reverence. By late summer, when the air grew thick and lazy, the garden gave more than we could eat. We packed baskets for neighbors, dropped off bags on porches, left bundles at church, and in doing so, the garden grew larger than its fence line. It fed the whole block. There were arguments, too, over spacing, over watering, over who left the gate open. But like weeds, we pulled those moments out and kept going, because the bigger picture mattered more, and every once in a while we'd catch ourselves mid-weed, mid-laugh, mid-sunburn, and think, this is what matters. By the time August rolled in, the garden had become our compass. We oriented our days around its moods, the way the sunlight hit the vines in the early hours, how the squash blossoms closed before lunch, how the bees disappeared like clockwork by late afternoon. It was a rhythm we hadn't invented, only joined. We learned to read the garden like a book. Leaves told stories. A wilted edge meant too much heat. Yellowing meant too little nitrogen. We'd huddle over the evidence like detectives, squinting at clues, debating causes. And sometimes we were wrong, but the garden never held grudges. It gave us another chance. There were surprises every week. Cucumbers hiding under leaves the size of dinner plates. A rogue sunflower that grew 6 feet tall out of nowhere. Strawberries that returned even after we thought the patch was done for the season. It was like the earth had a secret sense of humor, slipping jokes into the soil while we weren't looking. Even the chores became rituals. Watering before the sun got too high. Weeding in the cool dusk. Turning the compost on Saturdays. The kids grumbled, sure, but they showed up. They argued over who got the hose first, who found the fattest worm, who could fill the watering can fastest and not spill a drop. There was dirt under our nails always, on our knees always, in our socks somehow. But there was also pride, because every inch of that garden had been touched by someone who cared. Some evenings the whole family worked together without needing to say much. Just the rustle of corn stalks, the squeak of the wheelbarrow, the scrape of a hoe. And then someone would laugh at a crooked carrot, a bug in their shirt, a bird stealing seeds, and the whole row would join in. We had contests, informal and ever-changing. Who could grow the longest bean, the oddest-shaped potato, the most colorful bouquet. There were no prizes except bragging rights and an extra slice of pie. But that was enough. The garden also became a marker of time. You could measure a season by what was blooming, what was being picked. That was the summer of the watermelons, someone would say, and we'd all nod, remembering sticky fingers and rinds on the porch. The year the tomatoes came late. The year the peppers refused to grow. And slowly, without us realizing it, the garden stopped being something we worked on and started being something that worked on us. It softened our edges, made us patient, made us observant, made us generous. It taught us to look closer, at bugs, at buds, at each other. Even arguments seemed different when surrounded by green. Softer, easier to end. Hard to stay mad when you're both holding shovels. We talked about everything and nothing while we worked. About school, about dreams, about the neighbor's cat that kept sleeping in the mulch. And in between there were silences that felt comfortable, not empty, just full of shared understanding. We let the kids name their favorite vegetables. Some got nickname rocket beans, bubble tomatoes, monster squash, and those names stuck. We'd use them at dinner without thinking the language of the garden becoming part of the family dialect. We made signs for each row, not fancy, just wooden stakes with scribbled letters. But somehow it gave everything more dignity, more identity. Like the garden wasn't just a patch of earth, but a little village of characters. And in the middle of it all always was the scarecrow, stuffed with old shirts and wearing Dad's floppy fishing hat. The kids swore it worked, and maybe it did, not just on birds, but on us. A kind of sentry that made the garden feel watched over, protected, loved. Even on days when no one had time to work, someone would walk through, just to check, just to breathe in the smell of basil and wet earth, just to remember that something was growing, even when the rest of life felt stuck. The garden had become a kind of heartbeat, quiet, steady grounding. And as August turned to September, and the lights started shifting just a little, we began to feel it. The garden was winding down, but it wasn't done teaching us yet. We started saving seeds, corn kernels set out to dry on paper towels, basil seeds gathered in tiny jars. We labeled them with the kids' handwriting and tucked them into drawers for next spring. There was something powerful about it, this idea of continuity, that even as the vines withered, the story wasn't ending, just pausing. We began to talk about what we'd do differently next year. More peppers, fewer radishes, maybe build a proper trellis, maybe let the zucchini roam free. The plans grew even as the plants faded. That was the magic. The garden was always about what came next. We took photos of our harvest, not fancy, just snapshots with dirt-streaked fingers holding up tomatoes like trophies. Those pictures ended up taped to the fridge, framed on the wall, sent to relatives who knew the garden by name. And when the first real chill crept in, we didn't mourn. Not really. We pulled up the last plants, raked the soil, turned the compost one last time. We stood in the middle of the empty beds and breathed, because even in its barest state, the garden still held promise. Like a book turned to a blank page, waiting. Then came the final ritual, mulching. It sounds mundane, just laying straw or leaves or old newspapers over the bare beds, but it felt ceremonial, like tucking the garden in for a long-deserved rest. We did it slowly together, talking less than usual. Maybe because we all sensed that something was ending, or maybe because we didn't want to rush it. Every part of the garden seemed to whisper goodbye. The twisted vines, the bent tomato cages, even the smell less vibrant, now more earthy, deeper. That last week, we left one small section untouched. A few stubborn marigolds and fading basil stems. We said it was for the bees who were still hanging around half drunk on the last of summer. But maybe it was for us, too. A little piece of life left while the rest went quiet. And yet as the garden fell into stillness, something unexpected happened. We didn't stop going out there. In boots and sweaters, now we still wandered through the paths, coffee mugs in hand, pausing where the corn used to stand tall, where the beans had once tangled their way up the fence. The garden had become more than a space for growing. It was a space for remembering, for imagining. We started making plans not just for spring planting, but for a bench, for a tiny tool shed, maybe a wind chime, a little spot to sit and listen, because we realized even without vegetables, the garden gave us something, peace, perspective, a kind of slow breathing joy. We began to notice things we hadn't seen during the chaos of harvest, the arc of a spider's web catching frost, the symmetry of leaf skeletons, the tracks of tiny animals in the morning dew. It was like the garden now. Quiet was finally speaking clearly. And we listened. We found old seed packets in drawers and read them like bedtime stories. We traded recipes that we had made with our produce: zucchini fritters, roasted beets, basil lemonade. Each dish had a memory attached, a laugh, a moment. The food was gone, but the story stayed. One chilly evening, someone lit a small fire near the edge of the garden. Just a pile of twigs and dry stalks in a metal bucket. We sat around it with blankets holding mugs of something warm. And we talked about the carrots that looked like fingers, about the first tomato that got eaten by a raccoon, about how Grandma had grown the best dill, and no one could figure out why. The garden had ended, but it hadn't, because gardens don't just grow food. They grow families. That night we made a new tradition, a garden closing ceremony. Nothing formal, just a promise to come out once more together at the start of fall, to sit and remember and say thanks. Thanks to the soil, to the sun, to each other. And that fall, as the wind got sharper and the sky more gray, we left the garden with one last gift, a little sign, hand-painted crooked letters. See you in spring. It made us smile every time we passed it, and somehow it made the winter feel shorter. In that stillness between seasons, the garden taught us one final lesson, that not all growth can be seen. That sometimes the richest harvests happen quietly in the space between memories, in the warmth of shared silence, and in the hope of what comes next. We carried that hope with us into the cold months. In the way we folded blankets, in the way we flipped through seed catalogs with a bit more care, in the way we saved a single marigold seed in a glass jar and placed it by the window. Just one. But it was enough, because we knew the garden would wait for us. And in the quiet hours of winter mornings, as light crept through the kitchen window, we sometimes found ourselves looking out toward the garden. The rows invisible under a blanket of frost, the fences standing like quiet sentinels. It looked empty. But we knew better. We knew that under that stillness, life was preparing its return. Spring would come, the dirt would warm, and once again we'd press our fingers into the earth, planting not just seeds, but memories, laughter, and the promise that some things, even after all this time, still grow. When spring finally arrived, it didn't knock loudly. It whispered. There wasn't a single grand moment when we all ran outside cheering. It was slower than that, softer. One day we noticed the frost stayed away. The next a few weeds dared to poke through the mulch. And then just like that, the garden called us back. We returned not with fanfare, but with reverence. Pulling on gloves, stiff from storage, we stepped carefully between the rows, lifting off straw, like lifting a blanket from a sleeping child. Beneath it, life. Tiny shoots, damp soil, the faintest hint of green, and our hearts leapt. There is something about that first dig of the season, the way the shovel cuts into thawed earth, the smell that rises, the feeling in your bones that says it's time. We began slowly, not because we had to, but because we wanted to savor it. We raked, we turned compost, we sharpened tools and untangled hoses. We opened the old seed packets and laughed at the notes we'd scribbled in the margins. Too many zucchinis again. Try carrots farther from the fence. Marigolds, Vassar bee magnets. The garden was awake, and so were we. Children who had once helped grudgingly now volunteered. Teenagers found their way outside again, not because we asked, but because they remembered. The garden had become part of them, part of their story. We planted not just in rows, but in clusters, in spirals, in creative chaos. We tried new things, purple beans, rainbow chard, edible flowers. We let some things grow just because they were pretty, just because they made us smile. One morning we found a forgotten garlic clove sprouting on its own. No one claimed to have planted it. We decided it was a gift from last year's garden, a reminder that even what's left behind can bloom. Neighbors stopped by, drawn by the smell of tilled soil and the sound of laughter. They brought cuttings and stories, advice and curiosity. One brought her late father's tomato seeds, saved in a jar for 20 years. Another offered heirloom cucumber seeds with a wink and a warning, they take over if you let them, and we welcomed it all. The garden became a gathering place again, a place where stories grew alongside seedlings, where we paused to sip lemonade and watch the bees return, where we noticed the exact moment the lilacs bloomed and said it out loud like it was breaking news. One weekend, we hosted a garden picnic, just an old quilt, a few sandwiches, a jug of sweet tea. But somehow it felt like a holiday, like we were celebrating not just the garden, but everything it had carried us through. As the days grew longer, we stayed out later, pulling weeds by sunset, watering in the cool of the evening, watching lightning bugs rise like sparks from the edge of the yard. And through it all, we felt it. This wasn't just planting. It was reconnecting with the earth, with each other, with ourselves, because the garden wasn't just for food. It was for coming back to life. That spring, we planted something else too, hope. Not in neat rows, not in labeled packets, but scattered everywhere. In every laugh shared over a crooked row. In every patient wait for a seed to emerge. In every moment we slowed down, enough to notice the world turning green again. And maybe that was the garden's greatest gift. Not just the food, not just the flowers, but the reminder that after every long winter, something always returns. Eventually, the garden gave us something else, too, closure. Not every season was abundant. There were summers when storms knocked over our tallest corn, times when blight spread faster than we could fight it, seasons when rabbits made a feast of our lettuces before we even had a chance. But even in failure, the garden taught us to keep going, to plant again, to adapt, to forgive nature and ourselves. And in the quiet fall months, when the last tomato was picked and the vines began to wither, we didn't mourn the end, we honored it. We composted, we saved seeds, we cleaned tools and stored them with care. We sat on the back steps with our hands still dirt-stained, sipping cider and reflecting. Somehow the work of putting the garden to rest felt sacred. We trimmed what needed trimming, pulled what no longer served. We planted cover crops, not to feed ourselves, but to feed the soil. We tucked the earth in like a child, giving it time to rest. And as winter returned, so did the stillness. The frost crept in. Snow blanketed the beds. The trellises stood bare like skeletons of summer's joy. But we didn't feel loss. We felt rhythm, the pause that makes the song more beautiful. Indoors, we talked about next year. We flipped through seed catalogs, not with urgency, but with wonder. We passed down lessons learned. Start tomatoes inside sooner. Plant basil near the porch for easier picking. Don't forget how much the sun shifts by August. And the kids, now grown or nearly there, still joined the conversation. Because even as their worlds expanded, the garden stayed with them. In their hands, in their habits, in the way they now paused before tossing a peel into the trash, wondering if it should go to compost instead. Sometimes in the heart of winter, someone would walk past the window and glance out at the frozen garden, and they'd smile, because they knew. It wasn't gone, it was waiting. The garden had been our teacher, our therapist, our playground, our community center. It had helped us through hard times and made the good times even sweeter. It had taught us patience, humility, and the magic of small things. A single sprout, a perfect pepper, a bee hovering just long enough to remind us we are part of something bigger. And most of all, the garden had given us time together. Not the rushed kind, not the performative kind, but the slow dirt under your fingernails kind. The kind where no one checked their phone. Where we stood side by side in silence or told stories that wandered. Where joy came from watching something grow not instantly, but faithfully. So when we say the garden wasn't just for food, we mean it with every part of ourselves. It was for memories, for healing, for hope, for love, and for everything that couldn't be canned or pickled or frozen, but would last longer than any harvest ever could. Because once you've had a garden like that, it never really leaves you. It grows roots in your soul.